So the Ukraine conflict, the conflict in Ukraine is coming to an end. And we see this through a myriad of admissions in the Western mainstream media. Now, the battlefield situation is quite grim. Now, in Avdiivka, there is another Bakhmut situation. Ukraine is once again being grinded down. And the Western mainstream media itself is admitting this. They're admitting that indeed Russia it has the upper hand. Of course, we have to read between the lines, so to speak, because the Western mainstream media does not like to speak in clear terms, lest we actually be fed with a dose of truth behind all of the spin. But here you have Ukraine saying that Russian forces advancing on Ukrainian town from all sides. And if you read through this, it says Russian forces are intensifying their drive to capture the eastern Ukrainian town of Avdiivka, trying to advance on all sides after the weeks of fighting. The town's top official was quoted as saying, Russian troops have been pressing land and air-based attacks on Avdiivka since mid-October as the focal point of their slow-moving push through Ukraine's eastern Donbas region in the 21-month-old war. So when they say slow-moving, they're trying to smear Russia and saying it's not effective, but really this is a war of attrition that Russia has decided upon itself to conduct, and the slow-moving nature of it is actually all about grinding the full extent of Ukraine's military rather than forcing Ukraine to retreat rapidly in a very destructive offensive charge. Russia is pulling Ukrainian forces in and grinding them down quite effectively. And this is part of the after effects of the counteroffensive, where Russia did exactly this and ended up taking 90,000 plus of Ukraine's forces and more than 30% of all of the NATO armaments it has received in totality. Ukraine has received in totality. I mean, that is quite damning in just a few months period. So the latest push, it says the head of Avdiivka's military administration, Ukraine, Vitaly Barabash, followed reports last week that Ukrainian troops had made some headway in halting and pushing back the Russian advance. Things in Avdiivka have become even tougher. The intensity of clashes have been increasing for some time. The Russians have opened up 2 more sectors from which they begun making assaults in the direction of Donetsk, in the so-called industrial zone. The enemy is attempting to storm the city from all directions. And here you see the rhetoric, attempting. They're pushed back. This is all to give the illusion that somehow Russia surrounding the city and having the capacity to essentially take it from all sides is somehow an advantageous position. So that's one report. And then there's another report almost, and you can tell that the Western mainstream media is in a bit of a panic when they're publishing multiple reports after multiple reports. Here's the Independent. Russian forces encircle Ukraine's Avdiivka, and they're ready to storm the city after a months-long offensive. Russian operation to capture Avdiivka stalled by Ukrainian pushback as intense fighting reduces the former coal hub to rubble. So again, this is the Western mainstream media's attempt to make it seem like there is hope that Ukraine is pushing back rather than being encircled in this key town and rather than being grinded down. So Russian troops have encircled the eastern Ukrainian town of Avdiivka from all directions following a months-long offensive that's yet to see a significant breakthrough. Putin's forces have suffered some of their heaviest losses in the war so far, as they say, on Avdiivka in the Donetsk region, but have been facing a strong pushback from Ukrainian forces. Things in the Avdiivka sector have become tougher. So as you see, it's the same quote. They've become tougher over time. They are attempting to storm the city from all directions. So they're talking about the fierce fighting. They're talking about how everyone has basically been displaced from this city. And you notice the language, believed to be. Russia is believed to have suffered its heaviest losses, but it says that the losses have been 931 troops per day daily. That actually does not comport with mainstream numbers taken by prominent U.S.-backed institutions that suggest the losses have actually been quite a bit lower. So this is how they're trying to communicate the panic, right? They're trying to communicate the panic as a sign of strength. But there is no strength left for Ukraine. They are getting mired in another Bakhmut-like situation in the wake of a counteroffensive that went disastrously. Massive numbers of Ukrainian casualties, massive numbers of losses in the armaments that are not being replaced, and there hasn't been significant aid coming in ever since the counteroffensive. It was really, as John Kirby has already mentioned, the end of the rope. And Avdiivka is really the end of the rope, and it could be the end of the rope politically, as I'm going to show you. The Duran talked about this, and I want to play you their reaction to the consequences of what will happen possibly to Ukraine should Avdiivka fall to Russia, which it will, and it will in some due time. So here we go.
You know, as Avdiivka falls, so does Zelensky's government.
Yeah, I agree.
How true is that?
I think it is, and you can see this.
And can he cover it up? And can he cover it up like Bakhmut? That's my follow-up question. Can he cover it up like Bakhmut? Go ahead.
Well, he will. First of all, I mean, they will. I mean, we're still getting all these reports that, you know, thousands of Russians are dying in Avdeyevka. The British Ministry of Defense today said that plausibly, the Russians are losing 1,000 men a day across the battlefronts. What is bizarre about those claims, by the way, is that the Western governments and media outlets are ignoring the analysis of Russian losses carried out by the BBC and Media Zona, which is this NGO, which is Western funded.
And I showed that. The Independent is literally saying, look at how big these losses are from Russia, citing nothing but the Ukrainian government. Yet we have numbers conducted through analyses of the West itself that show something quite different.
And they don't actually corroborate any of this. They show that Russian losses are relatively low. There has been a spike, an upward spike during the fighting in Avdeyevka, as one would expect, but they're not reporting this huge surge in losses that Western governments and militaries and Ukraine is talking about. But they will go on talking about that. They will start to say all kinds of things. Firstly, we'll probably have about 2 weeks when the Ukrainians deny that Avdeyevka has fallen. I mean, that's what happened with Solidar. It was what happened with Bakhmut. Then they will probably never announce that Avdeyevka has fallen, but you'll find out eventually, if you follow the Western news, that it has indeed fallen. Then they will start to deny that Avdeyevka is particularly important. You know, that we've been told that it's this enormously important strategic point, the linchpin in the defense system. Then we're going to be told that, you know, it's actually irrelevant, that the Russians have suffered enormous losses capturing this irrelevant place. And then we'll be told that the Ukrainian forces that came out were largely intact and that they have created stronger fortified lines further west. We're going to hear all of this. But I think the reality is that Avdeyevka has been so built up, both in the West and even more so in Ukraine, and Ukraine morale now is so low that I don't think this time any of that is going to carry traction. I mean, they pulled it off in Mariupol. They pulled it off to a certain extent in Bakhmut and Solidar. I think this time what they're going to face is a really big credibility gap. And going back to your point about the fall of Avdeyevka leading to a governmental crisis in Kiev and quite plausibly the fall of Zelensky. Well, as you've been talking about yourself, you can see all the signs of political tension in Kiev now. You have had Zelensky sacking the deputy ministers of the Interior Ministry, which is the organization that is supposed to provide internal security. You can see lots of talk about a coup. claims that the Russians are trying to organize, a kind of counter Maidan in Kiev. This morning, a report from Ukrainian officials that Putin has given orders to the sleeper cells in Kiev to become activated to launch all of these protests. You have this constant sniping between Zelensky and Zelensky now, which is right there now in the open. You've got the sacking of generals, army generals, and criticisms of army generals. So you can sense the fear and the political tensions building up and growing all the time. So quite plausibly, there will be a political crisis. Quite plausibly, Zelensky's government might fall. I mean, it's not impossible. We are not far from that point. If it survives, it will survive in a fractured form. And only after what I would have thought was a major clear out of other people in the army, in the military, in the interior ministry, and then only because Zelensky still has enough backers in the West to see him through. But even that is now under question.
So the reason why I wanted to play that is because of the interplay between the political crisis in Ukraine and the battlefield situation. Oftentimes they're looked at as very separate, but it's quite clear that the further and further down Ukraine goes toward the path of defeat, the more and more difficult it becomes for the puppet regime in Kiev to remain functional. And now I don't think Avdeyevka, I don't think any of these attritional battles that Russia wins will necessarily be the straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak. But it is quite clear that there are a confluence of factors that indeed could be the tripwire that essentially ends the character of Kiev's regime as we know it. It could be the U.S. forcing elections and forcing basically Zelensky to be elected out. That is a very big possibility, especially as the battlefield situation grinds to a halt. The U.S. and NATO try to promote a stalemate situation. And what better way to solidify a so-called stalemate where an attritional war has no real hopes of ending than to create a new political situation in Kiev? So to give the impression, especially to American and Western audiences, that this conflict actually has a future, and it actually has a future that has seen some gains made by the United States and by NATO. But that is a very risky move because of the way that they propped up Zelensky, because of the way Zelensky is supposed to represent this so-called arsenal of democracy in Ukraine. So by ridding of Zelensky in any kind of form really does risk the project of Ukraine itself and its purpose in antagonizing Russia. But we see the political lines kind of being drawn. We see that as Ukraine's situation deteriorates on the battlefield, there are more and more fissures being exposed. Here you have the David Rakamia. He is one of the chief. He was a chief negotiator at the peace talks in Istanbul in the spring of 2022. He's also the head of the Servants of the People Party, aka Zelensky's party, and he has said that this conflict could have ended in spring 2022, which is in line with what we have been saying since spring of 2022, when the UK, basically giving US and NATO's wishes, when the UK under Boris Johnson traveled to Ukraine and to Kiev and said, scuttle this peace deal. Everyone has signed it, sure, but you don't have to. So there you have him admitting to this, right? That's one thing. And then you also have Russia then revealing what these peace terms would have been. They've done this before. I believe they did it in the eve of the Africa summit, the Russia-Africa summit, where they showed the papers of what they had signed and how all parties had signed it. But here it says Kiev could have stopped the conflict in April 22 by recognizing the Donbas republics and Crimea as Russian territory, said the head of Moscow's chief negotiating team, Vladimir Medinsky. The former culture minister led the Russian delegation at the Istanbul talks, where he said Ukraine missed the opportunity to end the war and save hundreds of thousands of its soldiers. Among our non-negotiable demands were the recognition of Russian sovereignty over Crimea, recognition of the independence of the Donbas republics. He added that they also had a long list of humanitarian demands pertaining to the protection of the Russian-speaking population of Donbas. In my estimation, not huge asks given the situation at the time. He insisted that Russia never set itself the goal of conquering Ukraine and that the chief objective of the military operation was the protection of Russian-speaking civilians. Advised by the West, however, Zelensky chose war. So this comes after the head of the Ukrainian delegation at the Istanbul talks, David Arakhamia, previously confirmed long-circulating rumors that the conflict could have ended just after 2 months had Kiev accepted Moscow's demand for neutrality. This was the main thing for them, said Arakhamia. They were ready to end the war if we accepted neutrality like Finland once did, and we would make a commitment that we will not join NATO. This was the main thing. Arakhamia confirmed previous media reports that Boris Johnson, the Ukraine prime minister at the time, told the Ukrainian government to keep fighting. So you have the obvious conclusion that could have been had. You had the obvious best case scenario at the time that could have been achieved, avoided altogether. And now you have a political crisis emerging in Kiev, basically at the behest of NATO. This is really reaping what you sow. And it gets more and more pathetic as time goes on, because now the news is, NATO has once again met, NATO leaders have once again met, and they are still doubling down on this mythical idea that Ukraine is going to join NATO. What NATO has done, what the United States has done, is they basically said, we fully support Ukraine joining NATO, but it cannot happen yet. And they keep having these instances where they mention this, where they talk about this. It can't happen yet. We can't have Ukraine in NATO yet, but it will happen, just not during a war, just not during this corruption scene that Ukraine, plague that Ukraine is sick with. Just not yet, but it will, because we fully support it. In a sense, they fully support the overall objective of antagonizing Russia, but they're not willing to go the full step, because taking that step would mean essentially the end of Ukraine. It is the red line for Russia. And not only is it the red line, but even without crossing it, they have already crossed other red lines. For example, backing Ukraine and its destruction of the Donbas, not respecting the sovereignty, and continuing to voice this goal without taking into consideration Russia's security interests. We're really always hearkening back to 2022, early 2022, late 2021, December, where the United States and where NATO essentially rejected any attempts, any and all attempts Putin had made and Russia had made to negotiate neutrality. And so here you have NATO keeping Ukraine invitation in back pocket. So in the back pocket, this is how bad things have become, where they can't even talk about this in a straight manner. NATO is always talking about this as we come together, we're united on the position, but we cannot take the action because they've lost the war. So NATO leaders have agreed to invite Ukraine to join the bloc, but time is not right, said Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO. The U.S.-led bloc's chief had earlier ruled out Ukrainian accession while the country is embroiled in a conflict with Russia. In an interview with Hungarian news website Index on Tuesday, released on the eve of the foreign minister level meeting of the NATO-Ukraine Council, Stoltenberg was asked to clarify when Kiev could finally achieve its goal of membership. The official, however, would not provide any specific dates. Stoltenberg claimed that Kiev is closer to NATO than ever, adding the bloc's leaders decided to invite Ukraine to join when conditions were met and where allies agreed. He noted Kiev had been allowed to take a shortcut on its path to accession, as it is no longer required to follow the membership action plan, NATO's program of advice and support for potential candidates. Asked whether the West is suffering from Ukraine fatigue, Stoltenberg appeared to dodge the question, reiterating that NATO would support Kiev for as long as it takes. He added the organization's member have provided the embattled country with more than 100 billion, or about 109 billion, in military aid since the start of the conflict. So, dodging. They're dodging. They're dodging the defeat, essentially. They're dodging the reality that, one, the collective West, at least people in the collective West, are pretty sick and tired of this conflict. They're not even paying attention to it now that Israel has basically gone completely and utterly unhinged and is pursuing a final solution against the people that have been prevented having their own nation and having self-determination for over 70 years. Now that everyone is paying attention to that, the United States and NATO has been given a bit of breathing room to allow this war of attrition to continue without any prospects of the U.S. and of NATO meeting its objectives. But yet they continue to circle the drain, continue to make circles around their stated objectives without acknowledging the reality. Because acknowledging the reality would mean essentially being forced by the weight of public opinion to do so. So, in effect, what you have here is you have Ukraine suffering more losses on the battlefield. You have the counteroffensive now leading into what is really a graveyard period for the conflict militarily. You have the United States, you have NATO reducing their aid to Ukraine in terms of scale. You have admissions over and over again, as covered by this channel, that there is not going to be some kind of ammunition revival, any kind of revival of the same kind of aid that Ukraine was getting to replenish militaries in the past. And also, Ukraine now has some pretty practical issues at hand, one being the fact that it's running out of people to send to die. It's running out of literal human beings to send to the slaughter. When that happens, it means the fighting has to eventually stop. You can't keep eventually, just like when you're pouring a bottle of your favorite drink, eventually that bottle runs dry. And that's what's going to happen to Ukraine. You have massive amounts of displacement. People have left. People have fled. They don't want to fight the war. And now you have reports in mainstream Western media publications that this sentiment is only growing. The sentiment of not wanting to fight. And that's going to lead to heavy conscription issues that are already taking place. So over and over and over again on all of these fronts. And then you have all these fronts, there is a deterioration in the situation for Ukraine. But this situation is most markedly seen, this crisis is most markedly seen on the political side of it. The political side of this conflict is reflecting the realities on the ground militarily, and it's reflecting what always was a broader reality that people in the West, brainwashed by the Western mainstream media, could not really see. They could not get the lesson that history has taught us about puppet regime after puppet regime, dictated, led, trained, funded, all of it by the United States and by NATO, is that these regimes eventually fall under the weight of their own corruption, their own mismanagement, and of course, the fact that they are always disposable because they don't represent the interests of people. They don't represent the interests of a country, if we call Ukraine that anymore. They don't represent the interests of any particular majority. They represent the interests of foreigners, of invaders, of those who seek to occupy and militarily encircle Russia, occupy the region and militarily encircle Russia for aims that have nothing to do with Ukraine. And regimes like that never survive, never last long in the same manner. They make many transitions. I mean, we see this all over the global south. This has happened over and over and over again. Whenever there is an illegitimate puppet government, we saw it in Niger recently, we're going to see it again and again and again across the world. Wherever there's a government that is serving an empire, that government cannot help but fall eventually, especially one that has been embattled and mired in a World War I style conflict, at least in terms of fighting style, for over a year. How could a government like that last for a long period of time? It's not possible. So the crisis of legitimacy is plaguing Ukraine now more than ever, Kiev in particular. And of course, that crisis of legitimacy reflects something a lot greater, which is the crisis of legitimacy of the masters themselves, of NATO, of the United States. They can't resolve this conflict without doing it on Russia's terms. They can't resolve any conflict without doing it on the terms of those they are targeting and those they are attempting to destroy. And that's because the world has indeed changed. The world is not where it was even 20 years ago, 30 years ago, where the US could operate as a hegemon and could operate without any kind of accountability from anyone else. No one could stand up to the United States militarily. And even when countries tried, they ended up generally being destroyed. That time, those days are over. Russia and China do not have these they don't have these weaknesses that countries in the global south who were unprepared and just could not defend themselves had. Now history has run its course, and you have a situation even in Gaza, even in Palestine, where the United States can't even get its way there because it can't balance a situation that it has facilitated, that it has let and allowed and inevitably gotten out of control. It cannot control that situation. If it can't control the situation in Palestine, where you have a people without a country, without self-determination, but yet with all of the support from the world, especially regionally, toward those aims, if the United States cannot handle that, what makes you think the United States can handle and manage a great power confrontation of which it has been pursuing with Russia and with China? No, the failures are going to continue to mount, and all that is going to happen is more destructive policies, so long as it is allowed, of course, by the people and by the and by those who do not have the power to determine policy. So long as those so-called policymakers, those who are dictated, controlled, and in bed with the most exploitative forces on this planet, military-industrial complex, the Wall Street banks, the major corporations and monopolies, all of those who are so invested in war, so long as they do not have any fear or any worry from the people, they'll continue to pursue the destructive policies, whether they fail or not. As long as they can reap some benefits from the whirlwind, they will continue to reap. So that is why it's important to be armed with this information, with this reality, so that we can become agents of history to change it. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.